Our speaker today is Rob Boston, and Rob is a senior advisor with the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and he's been associated with the organization for 35 years. So he knows his way. It's not his first rodeo, as they say, in this topic. He's also the editor of Church and State magazine, which is part of the organization. So he will be talking to us in a broad sense in terms of where the court is going and what the current issues are. And Rob, you might even be touching on some of the current cases that are out there in terms of separation of church and state. We also wanted to mention to you that Rob will be speaking, but he will not be presenting slides. So don't think that you're missing slides when you're not. Rob will just be talking to us on this important topic. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rob Boston. Rob?
Thank you, Louise, and thank you to all of you who have joined with us this afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Louise mentioned the Supreme Court rulings, and yes, there were several from the court this morning, and I was online. We've been waiting for a couple of decisions to come down from the court. They did not arrive this morning, but we are expecting those before the end of the month. Later in my talk, I'll be talking about some of those specific cases and what we expect from those and how they may change the relationship between church and state. What I want to do this afternoon is kind of hit on a couple of different things, some history, some discussion about where we are, some talk about where we might like to be. One of the things that's really important to recognize when we're discussing this issue of separation of church and state is that every nation has an origin story. And our origin story here in America is closely linked to the idea of religious freedom. I mean, how many times have you heard someone say that the United States was founded on religious freedom, or that people came here seeking religious freedom? There's a very powerful origin story that moves through our history and our culture, intimately connected to religious freedom. Well, an origin story is just that. It is a story. There are elements of history in an origin story, but there's also plenty of myth. And our task is to separate those two, and not to denigrate the myth, because myth is a powerful motivating factor for people. I mean, there's a reason why we tell each other myths. Sometimes it's just because they're enjoyable, but oftentimes it's because they teach a lesson. So the myth is important, but the myth must be separated from the history. And in the case of the United States, when we talk about people coming here seeking religious freedom, and when people say that, they mainly mean the Puritans and the Pilgrims, it is important to remember that they sought that religious freedom only for themselves. That these were people who had been persecuted in Europe, that did not have a broad expression of religious freedom, came here looking for that religious freedom, but then did not extend it to others. They were very much in a theocratic mindset, believing that their particular version of Christianity was true and pleasing to God, and therefore they didn't really have to tolerate competing versions. And that's important history, but it's also crucial to realize that that vision is not the one that was handed down that informs the experience we have today. In fact, that vision of theocracy and intolerance and not extending religious freedom to others became a kind of lesson that informed the founding fathers, something they wanted to avoid, something they wanted to do differently. So while the history is important, we have to understand the role that it played. And the reason I bring that up is because oftentimes there are people in our society, even today, who look back on the early church-state model during the founding period, almost with a form of nostalgia, like that was a good thing. And it really was not. It was theocratic, it was intolerant, and it's not really the model we want to look to today. And that story of the Puritans and the Pilgrims and their combination of church and state has greatly informed what I call the Christian nation myth. And the Christian nation myth, it is a pure myth. It is not historical, it is not factual, but it does motivate a lot of people politically today to do certain things or to behave in certain ways. It is used by politicians. And I want to talk a little bit about that at some length because it is an important one to address, especially at this point in time, when we see the Supreme Court renegotiating the boundary between church and state. lowering what Thomas Jefferson called the wall of separation between church and state. We see that happening at the Supreme Court. And we have to realize that some of this is occurring because people either consciously or subconsciously have been influenced by the Christian nation myth. Now, the 19th century German philosopher Hegel once said rather cynically that history teaches us that we don't learn from history. But I think that is probably a little bit too cynical even for me. I actually think we can learn a lot from our history if we choose to. If we choose to. But the challenge is, when we're looking at any period in history, whether it's the founding period or the Civil War, the period after, or even more recent forms of history, we have to be willing and able to stand up and look that in the face and understand that the purpose of history is not to make you feel good, is not to instill pride in your country. It is to tell you what happened. So any reading of history, any fair reading of history, is going to include some unpleasant facts. Now, that may seem like a no-brainer, but the reason I say that is because there are people today who are very actively seeking to suppress unpleasant forms and facts from our history, because they want a version of history taught that is very much rah, USA, we're right, we've never done anything wrong. They want to whitewash a lot of things, and we can't have that. That approach is many things, but it is not history. So one of the first things I think we need to do when we're looking at our history, especially in this area of separation of church and state, is recognize that there are, in fact, many good and positive things from that history. Those Puritans and those Pilgrims that I mentioned earlier, who were so intolerant and who believed in religious freedom only for themselves, we've moved far from that perspective to a vision of religious freedom that includes everybody, not just conservative Christians, but liberal Christians and moderate Christians and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and atheists and humanists and Wiccans and pagans and just about everything else. And we have that pure vision, that broad vision of religious freedom, because we realized that the idea of government trying to push religion or support religion or advocate for religion simply didn't work. So when we're looking at the Christian nation myth, there are some very important lines of evidence that we need to consider. The first is, what does our Constitution say? Now, I bring this up because sometimes people who advocate for the Christian nation myth will cite other documents. But those documents, as interesting as they may be, and as important as they can be in our history, are not governing documents. They're not the Constitution. The Constitution is our governing document, and the Constitution is a secular document. Now, despite what some people may believe, the text of the Constitution contains no references to Jesus Christ, Christianity, or God. It is a secular document. That alone is a remarkable thing when you think about the times when it was written. A time when most governing charters had references to God, Christianity, to Jesus. That was the more common thing to do. Our Constitution, as originally drafted, did not contain any of that. Furthermore, our Constitution contains a provision. This is the original Constitution I'm talking about, before the addition of the Bill of Rights. Contains a provision at the end of Article 6, which states that there shall be no religious test for public office. Now, when I say religious test, and when the Constitution says religious test, we're not talking about a kind of pop quiz. What we mean instead is that there will be no religious qualification for public office. In other words, you don't have to be a Christian to hold public office. You don't have to be a Protestant. You can't be denied public office because you're Jewish or a Muslim or a Buddhist or whatever. And that is in our federal Constitution because many states did have provisions at the time that barred public office to people who were non-Christian or non-Protestant in some cases, depending on the state. And at the federal level, lawmakers wanted to make it absolutely clear that there would be no provision like that. So this cuts against the very idea of the Christian nation, because if we were intended to be an officially Christian nation, we would not have put language in our Constitution explicitly guaranteeing the right of non-Christians to hold public office. Another interesting thing to consider is that this idea of the United States being declared officially Christian was debated at the time the Constitution was drafted. There were people who felt that the document should say that it should make some recognition of the Christian faith. They made their arguments, they put forth their perspective, but they did not carry the day. There was a delegate from Maryland named Luther Martin, who was a very strong advocate of the idea of the Christian nation. And Luther Martin, after his perspective had failed, gave a report to lawmakers in which he held out that, well, our Constitution, I'm paraphrasing here, the Constitution was not making any distinction between the adherents of Christianity and the adherents of downright paganism. So here was this man sort of arguing that our secular Constitution was not Christian, and in fact it was the same as if it had been a document drafted by pagans. Well, it wasn't that either. It was a secular document that said everyone should have the right to choose their own faith. So that cuts against the idea of the Christian nation. Another line of evidence that's very important is what were the political beliefs of the founders? Now, it can be difficult sometimes for us in our sort of modern pluralistic society, where we have so many different faiths, to get back to the mindset of what life was like in the post-revolutionary period, or even when we were a colony of Great Britain. As you probably know from the history you may have been exposed to over the years, there were different experiences with religion depending on where you lived in the colonial system. Some colonies, like Rhode Island, which had been founded by the iconoclastic Baptist minister Roger Williams, were havens for religious freedom for everybody. Roger Williams had started out as a Puritan minister, became a Baptist for a while, and kind of ended up as a spiritual seeker. But he believed strongly in the idea that everyone should be able to choose for themselves what religion, if any, they wish to support and belong to, and that his colony, Rhode Island, would guarantee that right. Roger Williams was a strong opponent of the idea of government-imposed religion. Remember, he's a minister, he's a Christian, he's a man of faith. He once said, "Coerced worship stinks in God's nostrils," because he felt that forcing people to take part in religion against their will was an offense against the Almighty, and no state should ever do that. So founders who came along later, men like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington and others, were advocates of the idea that the government should not have a say in the private religious affairs of the citizens. Now, that doesn't mean that they were against religion or that they opposed religion, merely that they felt that the state should not have any role in whether a person went to church, how they worshiped, when they worshiped, and who they worshiped with. Now, Thomas Jefferson is key to this argument and this discussion because he wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, a model for the First Amendment. Virginia, prior to the Revolution, had an Anglican establishment, that the Anglican Church was established by law in Virginia. Jefferson fought against that. He didn't believe there should be any established churches. So he wrote the Virginia Statute, originally introducing it in 1776, but not able to get it passed. And it was designed to do two things: end the establishment of the Anglican Church in Virginia and guarantee to all men, and they did use sexist language like that back then, guarantee to all men the right to choose their own mode of worship if they wanted to worship. Now, this particular piece of legislation, Jefferson was not able to get through when originally introduced. But some years later, after the Revolution, when Jefferson was in France representing our interests there, his colleague and protege, James Madison, persuaded the legislature to enact the bill. And there were efforts at that time to limit its protection. Remember, Jefferson's vision was for broad religious freedom for everybody, Christians and non-Christians. Some lawmakers in Virginia said, well, yeah, we should have religious freedom, but it should be just for Christians. You could choose what Christian denomination you wish to belong to. Well, that effort failed, and the bill passed as originally drafted by Jefferson. And Jefferson celebrated that fact. And in an autobiographical sketch that he wrote some years later, said that his bill was intended to protect the Christian, the Mohammedan, the Jew, the Hindu, the infidel of every denomination. So here's Jefferson really strongly expressing that idea that there would be religious freedom for everybody. As an effort to pass that particular piece of legislation, James Madison drafted in 1785 the Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. It is essentially a list of 15 reasons why no one should be forced to support a church against his or her will. Madison marshals strongly these arguments in favor of separation of church and state and makes it clear that Christian establishments are not just misguided, but in many ways an evil, something that should not exist in society. Jefferson and Madison worked with preachers, pastors, ministers who favored the separation of church and state very strongly. And these ministers made strong arguments for the separation of church and state. One of them was a gentleman named John Leland, who was a Baptist leader, a very devout man, a Christian, but he argued that, quote, this notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever. The idea that there should be an officially Christian state was offensive to many of these leaders. So their political views led them to oppose that. And interestingly, in many cases, so did their theological views. Now, it can be difficult, so many years removed from these individuals sometimes, to determine what exactly they did believe, especially in some cases where founders did not leave a lot of writings or a lot of clues behind. You know, James Madison is a good example of that. James Madison, I mentioned earlier, the author of the Memorial and Remonstrance of Against Religious Assessments, the father of the Constitution, a primary drafter of the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment, fourth president, an important figure in American history, kind of tight-lipped about his religious beliefs, nominally an Episcopalian. Some scholars think of him more as a deist. Not a lot to say, and people still kind of debate his views. But Jefferson, there's a lot to look at in Jefferson's case, because Jefferson wrote extensively about his particular religious beliefs. And George Washington left us some clues as well. So we can look at some of these early founders and we can determine, were they the kind of devout fundamentalist Christians that some Christian nationalists today argue that they were, and they simply were not. Deism is a system of religion that you don't hear about a lot today because it's fallen out of favor. Deism was a product of the European Enlightenment, which greatly influenced efforts in America. The deist held that there was a God who had put the world into motion, had created it, but then sort of stepped back from it. So the idea of an activist God or a God that responded to a lot of prayers, that was not really a deistic God. A deistic God was an architect, a designer, a creator. That's why you sometimes hear terms like that or see them in documents from that time. Terms like creator, supreme architect of the universe. Those are deistic terms. So the deist God is not exactly a fundamentalist Christian God, but this is the kind of God that a lot of our founders did tend to rally around. Jefferson once said, and this is a kind of a remarkable quote, I'm going to read this to you because think about somebody saying this today. Jefferson said, this is in 1823 in a letter to John Adams, the day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus, by the Supreme Being, as his father in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter. So here's Jefferson saying that the story of the virgin birth would one day be just thought of as another myth, like a classical myth. Hard to believe anybody saying that today and being elected to public office. Jefferson was once asked about his religious beliefs in a letter to a friend. He wrote in 1819 that he rejected the following ideas of Christianity. He rejected the Immaculate Conception, the deification of Jesus, the creation of the world by Jesus, the miraculous powers of Jesus, the resurrection, the corporeal presence in the Eucharist, the Trinity, and original sin. Now, these are standard doctrines of the Christian faith, yet Jefferson made it clear that he rejected them all. Some of you may be aware that Jefferson rewrote the Bible, that he took the New Testament and he took a knife to it and he cut out all the things he did not believe. Jefferson greatly admired the moral teachings of Jesus and looked at him as a great moral teacher, but didn't believe in his divinity, did not believe he performed miracles, didn't believe he was the Son of God. So he cut all that stuff out. He pasted up what was left, and it's still available today. It's called the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, or sometimes more informally, the Jefferson Bible. So this was a man who clearly had some qualms about embracing traditional fundamentalist Christian belief, certainly. George Washington, again, more deistic, spoke very commonly about things like the supreme architect of the universe, operating from very much a deistic point of view. John Adams, our second president, and a friend of Jefferson, once talked about the idea of the Trinity. He got into an argument with a visitor to his home about the Trinity. Adams was a Unitarian, didn't believe in the Trinity. And as he argued with this man, eventually this fellow fell back on an old argument that people often use in religion. They'll simply state that if you can't understand something, that's because it's a mystery. It's a divine mystery. We can't understand the Trinity, this man argued to Adams, because it's a divine mystery. To which case Adams wrote to Jefferson, thus mystery is made a convenient cover for absurdity. Now, when you think about some of these statements, they really are shocking, because it's difficult today in some parts of the country for someone to get elected to public office without, at the very least, being religious, and sometimes they need to be Christian or even conservative Christian. So that the founders held some of these views that were deistic and rejected tenets of Christianity is interesting, but also points to the fact that they would not have established an officially Christian state. That was not something they personally believed in. Another line of evidence comes from the 18th and 19th centuries. And here I think this is interesting, because a lot of people know this history. It's not well known. It's not often taught. That is this: after the Constitution became the governing document of the country. Remember, we operated under these Articles of Confederation for a while, and they were not very effective. So the delegates got together, drafted the Constitution, then a few years after that, the Bill of Rights. But after the Constitution was adopted and word started to get out about that, and it was printed in a lot of newspapers, it was printed as pamphlets, it circulated that way. And in an age before mass communication, that's how people found out about things, oftentimes even by word of mouth. But as that word started to spread, there were ministers who attacked our Constitution for being godless, for being secular. Some of them felt that our nation could not survive because we had failed to embrace Christianity, because we weren't an officially Christian state. They wanted to see that type of an arrangement. When they learned that the Constitution did not establish Christianity or give it any preference or even a mention in the governing document, they were extremely angry, and they attacked that. There's a story told, it's considered apocryphal, but it's amusing, that Alexander Hamilton was walking around Philadelphia after the ratification, after the Constitution had been adopted or drafted. And he was verbally attacked by a man, demanding to know why there were no references to God or Jesus in the document. And to this, Hamilton supposedly said, "Oh, we forgot." Again, an apocryphal story, but the fact that it was told is, again, an indication that this was on the minds of people, that there was a faction of individuals who were very angry that there was no mention of Christianity in the Constitution. They wanted it to be an officially Christian state. Now, eventually what happened is some people began to think, well, since the Constitution is secular, since the Constitution doesn't contain any references to Christianity, it doesn't preference it, we should fix it. It should say those things. This movement got started in the North during the Civil War by a group of ministers who called themselves the National Reform Association. Now, the National Reform Association had a number of agenda items that it wanted to see enacted. One was it wanted to get some mention of God on American currency, which it eventually was able to do. They also advocated for strict Sunday closing laws to curtail commerce on what they considered to be the Lord's Day. But their big effort, their big prize they were after, was to rewrite the preamble to the Constitution to put specific references to God, Jesus Christ, and Christianity. Now, during the Civil War, this just wasn't happening because obviously the government had other things it was tending to in the North, federal government. After the war, and as Reconstruction began to wind down, this movement began to pick up some steam. And the ministers actually submitted it's called the Christian Nation Amendment, but what it actually would have done was it rewrote the preamble to the Constitution to include specific references to God, Jesus Christ, and Christianity. And this amendment was proposed originally in 1864, as I said, not really getting any kind of leverage there. But reintroduced in 1874, it got a vote in a House committee. Now, the committee voted it down, but it did get this vote. And as it continued to move in Congress, people began to talk about this as a way to correct what they perceived to be a mistake of the founders. Now, obviously, this thing never became part of our Constitution. We know that. But it was reintroduced in 1882, and then remarkably resurfaced in the early 1960s, being reintroduced in 1961, 1963, and 1965. As I said, obviously, it never passed. But the very fact that there were people arguing that we needed to put Christian identity into the Constitution is strong evidence that it was not intended as part of the original founding, that we were not founded to be a Christian nation because people were trying to put it in later. That myth, the Christian nation myth that I've referred to a couple of times here, its genesis is really post-Civil War. It's not from the founding period. It's post-Civil War. Now think about that time in our history. What the nation was going through then. Trauma, violence, war, terror, and uncertainty. And whenever you get situations like that, some segment of the population does start to embrace extreme religious movements as a way of processing this trauma and frankly, change that many people are unsettled by. So as a result, people begin to advocate for this Christian nation idea. And that's really the beginning of that movement. And the reason I point that out is because there are people today who will argue that, this is something that goes back to the founding period. And the founders embraced that idea. Well, no, they did not. They left us a constitution that's quite different in its wording. And then this idea of the Christian nation really didn't start to gain traction until much, much later in our history. Now, it still has a hold today. That's the interesting thing. Well, why? Why the power of this myth? And I'm talking about something that really got started during the Civil War. Here we are, many, many years later, still inspires people to action today. Any of you who have seen video footage or still photographs from the January 6, 2021 insurrection, we're seeing that again in light of the hearings. You don't have to look far at those videos or examine many of those photos to see people hoisting crosses and Bibles and pictures of Jesus. There absolutely was a Christian nationalist element in the insurrection that motivated a lot of people to attack the Capitol. We can see its strength. It's still out there. This is Pride Month, and it was just a story, and you might have seen in the media about some extremists being arrested in Idaho, religious extremists who were going to disrupt and possibly physically attack people attending Pride events there. So this is a motivation for people sometimes to act in violent ways and sometimes to just do certain things politically. Well, why the hold of this myth? And I think it does a couple things for the advocates of it. One is that it portrays this idea of kind of a national goodness. I mentioned earlier about how some people don't like to face unpleasant facets of our history, that we've been a racist nation, that we've suppressed the rights of women, that we have not been fair to the native inhabitants of this land. I mean, this may seem like fairly obvious stuff, but there are people who are very threatened by that history. They don't want it taught. They want instead this idea of national goodness. Oh, we've always been a great nation. We've always treated people well because how could we do otherwise? Because we're a Christian nation. That's one factor. Another thing it does is it motivates people by promoting an idea of what's called a stolen legacy. Stolen legacy is like this. We had this great, wonderful thing. We had this wonderful Christian nation, God's favorite country, and it was taken from us. And it was taken from us by, well, whoever the enemy of the day is, liberals, feminists, advocates of racial justice, whoever, the ultra conservatives want to pin this blame on, and that can vary from day to day. They're taking away this great, wonderful thing we had. It motivates people to react to social change. I alluded to this earlier, the changing nature of our country, much more religious diversity. In the late 1950s, pollsters would ask people in America about their religious beliefs. And about 95 or 96, sometimes 97% would say that they were Christian. Think about that. 96%. That's in the 1950s. Well, here we are in 2022, and pollsters are asking that question still. And now the number of people who say they are Christian is 65%. That's a 30% drop. That is significant. And after Christianity, do you know what the most popular religion in America is? It's none. No religion. Now, people who say they have no religion aren't necessarily atheists or agnostics, but they're people who are just sort of doing their own thing when it comes to spirituality, as the First Amendment gives them the right, but that's threatening to a lot of people, and they're worried about it. So the Christian nation myth spurs them to stand up against societal change. The Christian nation myth can become a means for political power. Many politicians use it to rile a base, to stir people up. Donald Trump, although not known to be an especially religious man himself, used the Christian nation myth to inspire and win votes from folks who have that kind of Christian nation mindset. This revisionism is out there, is powerful, it affects our political system. And its impact right now is even though that society is changing, even though we see those numbers I talked about, fewer and fewer people identifying as Christian, ironically, even as that trend unfolds, Christian nationalism is becoming more potent and more powerful. There are a lot of books that have been written by scholars recently about Christian nationalism. And I would recommend books by Andrew Whitehead, Samuel Perry, Catherine Stewart, and others who are exploring this phenomenon and explaining it to people. It is a powerful motivating factor in our politics right now, so you need to be aware of it. It is not dying out, especially even as these trends evolve, because it is politically powerful for certain people to use it, and that's why that continues. So that's some history. History is important, as I said. History tells us where we've been. We can't understand where we are if we don't know where we've been. So that's why I spend some time talking about history. But I want to talk about where we are now, the next phase, because where we are now is, well, it's disturbing from my perspective. The organization I work for, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, we have for a long time advocated for this idea for 75 years that religion and government function best when they're separate. Now, we are not taking that perspective because we hate religion. Far from it. In fact, our founders in 1947 were members of the clergy. They were religious leaders who believed that religion would be corrupted if it became a tool of the state. So they argued very forcefully for the idea of voluntary support for all religion and no coercion from the state in matters of faith. And for a while, for a long time, that view held sway. The idea that there should be a strict separation of church and state, respecting what Thomas Jefferson, in his famous 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists of Connecticut, called the wall of separation between church and state, embraced by the Supreme Court for a long time. But now we're seeing that wall being eroded and being chipped away. And I want to talk about some specific areas where that's happening because it is a concern. One is a question of funding. Religious institutions in the United States should rely on voluntary contributions for all of their projects, for their schools, for their soup kitchens, for their shelters, for their other projects. Traditionally, that's been the practice. A church wants to open a school or wants to open some other kind of a social service project, they ask their members to pay for it. If the members can't pay for it or don't want to pay for it, then the church or the synagogue or the temple or whatever it might be doesn't do the project. Well, in more recent years, the Supreme Court has been saying that, oh, it's okay to give taxpayer money to religious schools. In fact, it may even be required under certain circumstances because failure to extend it is discrimination. I think this is a big mistake. The idea that we will have taxpayer-supported religion in the United States does not come from America. It does not come from the founders' experience. It is a European model that was adopted in the late Roman Empire into the Middle Ages. It informed experiences in Europe, but it is alien to our traditions. And I would submit to you that the taxpayer funding, taxpayer support of religion in Europe has killed religion in those nations. Because church became so dependent upon state, its vitality and its strength drained. Compare the churches and the houses of worship of European societies with those in America. Attendance rates in those European countries are very, very low. Even in England, which has an official church, the Church of England, the number of people who belong to it or support it is dismally low. Compare that to the United States, where we still, despite the number of people who are leaving organized religion, we still have very vibrant religious communities. So the model of taxpayer funding of religion is dangerous both to church, because it saps their vitality, and to individuals because it forces them to support religious institutions that they do not belong to and that they may strongly disagree with. Now, there are some instances where religious institutions can run public services if they're willing to serve everybody, if they're not going to discriminate, if they're not going to force religion onto anybody, they might be able to get some limited types of support. If a church is running a soup kitchen and it allows everybody to come in and it doesn't discriminate and it doesn't tell people that they have to watch a video about Jesus before they get their meal, then the government may be able to support those types of things. But again, I think they're best supported with voluntary contributions. But we're seeing significant erosion of that principle, of the voluntary principle. And honestly, I think it's much to the detriment of religion in the United States. A lot of people will have the attitude, if religion is supported by the government, then why should I do it? Why should I dig deep into my pocket on Saturday or Sunday morning to put a few dollars in the collection plate if I've already done it through my taxes? So I think one of the reasons we're seeing changes in attendance in religion in the United States is that people are feeling that there's too much taxpayer support already going there. So that's one area where we're seeing a lot of changes. Another area where we're seeing significant changes is the role religion plays in public education. Now, little history here too is helpful, because there's a myth out there supported by Christian nationalists that all of our public schools had prayer and Bible reading until 1962, when that mean old Supreme Court took it out because an atheist filed a lawsuit. And that is just balderdash. That's not what happened. First of all, public education in the United States really didn't start to take hold until after the Civil War. And as it did, some states began passing laws mandating that young people attend public schools. Some states had prayer and Bible reading, some did not. But it was always controversial. In the 19th century, there were cases in the state courts challenging school sponsorship of prayer and Bible reading. Some state courts struck it down. Some state courts upheld the practice. It reached the US Supreme Court in 1962 in a case out of Long Island, New York, brought mainly by Jewish and Unitarian parents who challenged a prayer that had been written by the New York State Board of Regents. This was called the Regents' Prayer. This was a government-imposed prayer. I mean, what a bad idea that you could bring into your school if you were a superintendent or a principal and you wanted to recite it, you could bring it in. It had supposedly been composed with consultation from an ecumenical body, but it was a watered down, very generic type prayer, but still offensive to many people. And the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-1 ruling, June 25th, 1962, so the anniversary is coming up, that this was unconstitutional. Following year, the Supreme Court struck down practices in Pennsylvania and Maryland of opening the school day with readings from the Bible. It was almost always a Protestant version of the Bible. 10 verses were read usually, and that was challenged in both states, in Pennsylvania by a Unitarian family named the Shemps, and in Maryland by the famous atheist Madeline Marie O'Hara. Supreme Court, again, 8-1 ruling, struck those practices down. They did not rule, and they never have ruled, that students don't have the right to pray. What they have ruled is that prayer cannot be imposed upon students in a public school. So if students in a public school want to pray, before a test, before their lunch, or any other point in the day where they feel they need spiritual guidance and their prayers are non-disruptive or not infringing on anybody else's rights, they can do that. And in fact, I'm sure they do. Many public schools these days host religious clubs during what's called non-instructional time, normally the end of the day, where students get together voluntarily for prayer and Bible reading. If it's a Christian club, there are Jewish clubs, there are Buddhist clubs and Hindu clubs, and there are some atheist clubs. We have to be fair. Everybody has the right. There can be Wiccan clubs too, and pagan clubs. All religions have to be treated equally in the public school, but these are student-run, totally voluntary. Nobody has to attend if they don't want to. That type of religious expression is fine. And of course, public schools may teach about religion as an historical subject. They may teach about religion's impact on art, on literature, on music. In fact, they would be remiss not to do that. Many of them are, as long as it's objective, as long as it's fair. So there's a lot of mythology about this issue. The problem we're having is the Supreme Court again here is chipping away at these rights. They have a case before them that will be decided within the next few weeks. My organization, Americans United, is involved in this case. We're representing a school district in Washington State that was sued by a football coach, a high school football coach, who insists that he has the right to pray with students at the 50-yard line after the games. Now, historically, the court has said that school officials, school employees, whether they be teachers, coaches, administrators, etc., do not have the right to pray with students. That is a usurpation of parental rights. But this coach is saying he has that right, and the Supreme Court seems sympathetic to his perspective. We'll have a ruling on that. Our attorney, Richard Katsky, argued the case before the court in late April, and Richard, I thought, did an excellent job. But unfortunately, it is a very conservative court, and one that we are seeing turn its back on some of the traditional rulings on separation of church and state. Another area where we're seeing significant change is the symbolic use of religion by the state. And what I mean by here are things like the display of religious symbols, usually Christian, in public spaces. These are often portrayed as memorials to veterans or folks who have died in wars. But obviously, a cross, which is the central symbol of the Christian faith, cannot represent all of our war dead, because those individuals come from many different religious traditions and no particular traditions. And to have a cross symbolize them all is offensive. And the Supreme Court a few years ago, unfortunately, upheld the display of a very large cross in Prince George's County, Maryland, in Bladensburg, that was erected around the time of the First World War to memorialize some veterans of that conflict, but later, many years after the fact, was rededicated to represent all veterans. But again, it is a cross. It cannot memorialize all veterans. Now, I want to be clear, on private property, on church ground, on land owned by religious institutions or private individuals, they can display whatever religious symbols they like. And in some cases, if there's a public forum, religious groups can use that as secular groups can. In front of the courthouse in December, if Christian groups are allowed to display nativity scenes and Jewish groups are allowed to display menorahs, then atheist groups can come in and display their symbols, and Wiccan groups can display their symbols, and everybody's displaying that symbol on their own time with their own dime. We have no problem with that. I'm talking here about the government's display of certain religious symbols, usually Christian. That is a problem. But again, the court is drifting away from that. And that, just as an aside, there also are a lot of issues of this in our daily life that you may not even think about anymore. If you reach into your pocket or your wallet and pull out some money, you're going to see "On God We Trust" stamped on that. Well, that dates back to 1956 when that use was codified and made the national motto. But it's problematic. Not everybody believes in God. Not everybody believes in the God that is expressed on that currency. This is not something that the Supreme Court or lower courts are likely to take seriously right now, but it's something I think that we need to look at. Even the use of "Under God" and the Pledge of Allegiance, again, a more modern development. Pledge of Allegiance, originally written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy, a minister and a socialist, was later modified in the 1950s during the Red Scare to include religious reference to God that was not in the original pledge. So these sorts of things, people look at them and they think, oh, it's ceremonial, what's the big deal? Well, it requires a person to make a statement of belief as a condition of expressing their patriotism, and that's just wrong. So even though that's not something we work on a lot today because of the nature of the courts, it is something over the long haul I think we do need to look at. Another area that I want to talk to you about today is the question of what religious freedom actually is. Now, that may seem like a rather towering question, and it is. What does religious freedom mean? You know, think about the First Amendment's religious freedom provisions are only 16 words long. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's it. 16 words. Imagine today's Congress trying to express a fundamental human right in 16 words. I think they couldn't do it. Now, our founders did it, and there's much to be admired there. I'm an editor. As an editor, I admire the economy of language, but I also acknowledge that it's somewhat vague. No law, really? There can be no law restricting the free exercise of religion? Well, that obviously isn't the case. You can't commit human sacrifice as part of your religion. You can't break the law. And that has long been the understanding in the United States, that religious practices that subject other people to harm or that restrict their rights can be curbed or banned outright. Well, we're seeing erosion of that standard at the Supreme Court too. The Supreme Court is moving toward, inching toward, a dangerous, in my perspective, vision of religious freedom that does include the right to subject others to harm. We've seen a spate of cases where owners of secular businesses, for-profit secular businesses, don't want to serve members of the LGBTQ community, don't want to serve Muslims, don't want to serve atheists because of the owner's particular religious belief. We're talking here about bakeries, photographies, caterers for weddings, people who make wedding invitations or products. Remember, we're not talking about houses of worship here. Everybody agrees that houses of worship have the right to decide who they will give their sacraments to. A house of worship doesn't have to let you through its doors if it doesn't want you to be there. A minister, a rabbi, a priest does not have to perform your wedding ceremony. That's totally up to them. They have that right. What we're talking about here are businesses, for-profit, non-religious businesses. And when I think about this new form of discrimination that's using religious freedom as a cover, it takes me back historically to an unpleasant time in our history where we denied rights to entire classes of citizens based on the color of their skin. Restaurants wouldn't serve African Americans. Hotels wouldn't serve them. Other businesses wouldn't serve them. We passed laws designed to stamp out that form of discrimination in public accommodations. To see that type of discrimination gain a foothold again under the guise of religious freedom, I believe does a disservice to that noble principle. To force religious freedom to become an excuse for shabby forms of discrimination is a disservice to that grand principle, because that principle of religious freedom is designed to give you and me and everybody else the right to decide how we want to worship, where we want to worship, with whom we want to worship, when we want to worship. It does not give you the right to impose your faith on someone else or treat them like a second-class citizen because your religion just doesn't happen to agree with them. And we are seeing this principle extended into many areas of our lives today where it had traditionally not been permitted or allowed. And this is disturbing. There are other issues we're dealing with. There are questions of reproductive rights, obviously at the top of a lot of people's thoughts these days, as the Supreme Court appears to be on the verge of overturning Roe v. Wade, the landmark 1973 case that established the right to legal abortion in America. That has a significant church-state dimension to it. Laws that are based on some religious groups' understanding of when life begins, but not others, are clearly problematic from a church-state perspective. We could see the rights of the LGBTQ community be restricted because of religious beliefs. There are people arguing for that. Again, these issues of LGBTQ rights, marriage equality, and so on have a significant church-state component to them. When the United States was undergoing the argument over marriage equality, around 2012, 2013, 2015, when the Supreme Court ruled on the matter. Many of the arguments used against marriage equality were religiously based. People would say, well, the Bible says that's not right, or the Pope has issued a decree saying that's not right. Well, okay, great for the Pope and great for whoever wrote that passage in the Bible, but that's not what we base our laws on. We don't base our laws on what the Bible says, or some people think the Bible says, or papal decrees. We base our laws on our Constitution and our secular governing documents. So even though that aspect of things wasn't a significant factor at the Supreme Court in 2015 when marriage equality was extended nationwide, it should have been, because that was an attempt, oftentimes, to impose a type of religious law on people today. And we continue to see those efforts. We are seeing in this country right now, unfortunately, a growing spate of book censorship efforts, both in public schools and in public libraries, and sometimes even at private booksellers. And again, oftentimes when censorship efforts are launched, historically, they are grounded in someone's religious beliefs. This is an issue we followed in Americans United since our founding. A lot of things used to be banned in this country: books, magazines, films, stage plays, because they offended the religious beliefs of the ruling elite. Well, that type of censorship was eventually struck down by the courts arguing that it's really no business of the government to determine what is blasphemy or what is heresy. And as long as something is not legally declared obscene, people should be able to see it, even if it is considered offensive to some folks' religious beliefs. Well, a lot of the arguments that are being made are that this material is offensive or that it's inappropriate. Oftentimes, claims are made that this is designed to protect children, but what really people are actually trying to do is remove this material from circulation because it offends certain religious believers. So we really have our hands full these days. Concept of separation of church and state that had held sway in this country for many, many years is now being looked at in a new light by the Supreme Court. Folks ask how this happened. Well, it's very simple. It's because of elections. Remember, Supreme Court justices and lower federal court judges are appointed, named by the president, either confirmed or denied by the U.S. Senate. The House doesn't play a role. It's up to the Senate. And if they're approved, those individuals get a lifetime seat on the federal courts. During the presidency of Donald Trump, we had 3 vacancies on the Supreme Court, and as a result, the court has become much more conservative. Now, Americans United is a nonpartisan organization. We are not affiliated with any political party. We're not allowed to endorse candidates or get involved in those types of races. But we are allowed to remind people that the federal judiciary, especially the Supreme Court, is often the final arbiters of these issues. Therefore, the men and women who are appointed to those courts, especially the Supreme Court, are going to have the last word. So you want to be aware of what types of individuals end up on our courts. What are their views on these issues and how do they deal with it? What are their beliefs about the separation of church and state? I'll conclude, and then we'll move on to take some questions, but I want to conclude just by saying that what we're being asked to give up here is something very significant. For a long time, since the founding period, that protective barrier, that wall of separation, as Jefferson put it, has served to defend both government and religion. And I want to stress that because oftentimes our opponents will argue that separation of church and state is really just, it's an attack on religion. It's designed to suppress religion, keep it down. And that's not what it's designed to do at all. It is designed to protect both of those institutions, to keep houses of worship from being entangled in corrosive affairs of the state, and to keep the state from lapsing into a kind of oppressive theocracy. Now, I'm not a historian. My degree was in journalism, but I enjoy reading history. And one of the lessons that comes through absolutely clear from any fair reading of history is that combinations of religion and government, no matter where they existed in history, always end up suppressing human freedom. They never lift it up. They always have the opposite effect. They are about suppression. They are about control. They are about violence, war, and terror sometimes. And if you doubt me about that, I urge you to simply pick up any history of the Middle Ages, and you will read what happened to people due to hundreds of years of government and religion working together in tandem to control, coerce, and force people on matters of faith. So when people ask me, well, what are you going to do about this? Because you have this situation with the Supreme Court and the erosion of the wall of separation between church and state. Well, I say there are a couple of things. Number one, we're going to be always reminding people that what the court is doing right now is not going to work for our country. I talked earlier about those changes in American society. The drop in the number of people who are Christian, the growth of what are called the nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who would ask their religious beliefs say none. The diversity, the range of Christian thought, even from very liberal to very conservative. That trend is going to continue. And as it grows and as it continues to take hold, a model of church-state relations that puts one version of Christianity above all others legally simply is not going to work for us. The culture is going to have to change that. And the culture will change it because it is not workable. It is not effective. It is not what we want. It's not going to happen overnight. It is going to take some time. Any rights movement that you struggle for takes an investment of time. African Americans did not win their right to vote overnight. Women did not win the right to vote overnight. Members of the LGBTQ community did not win their rights overnight. It is a decades-long involvement. And some of the people who are laying the groundwork for this right now may not live long enough to see it bear fruit, but they will pass the torch to the next generation. So what are we going to do? I'll tell you what we're going to do. At Americans United, we are going to rebuild that wall of separation between church and state every day, day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, brick by brick. Let me say that again, brick by brick, until once again, that barrier is the high protective wall it was always intended to be. Thank you, and I will be happy now to move on and take any questions that you might have.
Yeah, Rob, that was fantastic. I'd be willing to bet that you were a member of, if not the president of your debate club in high school and college. That was very informative, at times very moving. And we have a lot of questions rolling in.
Great.
From our 180 plus viewing audience. But before we get into the questions, I do want to just have a word from our sponsor, so to speak. And let me just share the screen and talk about the upcoming Encore Learning Presents presentations. If I can get a full screen. Well, let's see. Okay, there we go. So on June 27th, we cover the topic of culture wars in America, more specifically, the attacks on many of the fundamental rights such as voting, reproductive health, and LGBTQ protections. And it's interesting, in that this topic on June 27th is maybe there's a connection with the one today. Some of these attacks are coming from a kind of a religious perspective, if you want to put it that way. So I think that's kind of a good follow on to what we have today. And then on Monday, July 11th, we will look at the arts in China and Japan with an eye to what they can tell us about those cultures and societies. So please put those on your calendar. They're at the same time as this one, beginning at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. They are virtual, and you can tune in using the same, join using the same Zoom meeting number. And as always, you can go to encorelearning.net to get that information. And then I know we probably, I know from the questions that we have people from certainly all across the country. Many of you may not be a member of Encore Learning. That's fine. You can join us on any of these public presentations. But for those that may be interested, I do want to mention that there's a lot of benefits to becoming a member. You do have to be of a certain age. It's 15 above, but we offer high quality college level classes, 2 kind of semesters, one in the spring and one in the fall. We have many clubs, a book club, film club, I think chess club, bridge, all kinds of clubs. And also we have tours of museums and outdoor sites of interest. And many of these activities are virtual at this point in time. Many of the classes are virtual, we are trickling back in live. But so people that aren't necessarily in the Arlington, Virginia area, that's really not an impediment at this time, becoming a member and taking advantage of these benefits. So I did want to mention that, and let me stop that share. So let's get into the questions. So the first one we have is from Alan. Can you clarify what is meant by established church? And I'll just add to that. You know, you did mention Jefferson and the attempt for Virginia to have an established church. And I guess there were many states, some that did have an established church. If you can explain what the legal construct of that was and how that has changed, I guess, since the beginning of our nation.
Right. Yes. Well, an established church at the most basic level is simply a church that has state favor. It's supported by the state. It's considered the state's official religion. It usually receives state support through tax funding, and its ministers have a better status than everybody else. They have a special relationship with the state. Church of England would probably be the most familiar example of that to folks today. But I would remind folks that our First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which is a broader term. And I think that more broad use shows that the founders were concerned with more than simply the fact that there might someday be a church of the United States. They were concerned about some other things as well. Establishment meaning, no taxpayer support or other direct forms of support for religion through the state.
Okay. And then there's this, we have a number of questions. So it's, let me try to group them together about taxation. So I know Mark mentions that, there's, I don't know if every local area exempts them from property tax. And then also there's a question about, how does that come about? Isn't that a blatant breach of separation of church and state? So also a question of, well, okay, if they get involved in political statements, does that affect their tax status? And I guess I was also add that, all the donations that are made to churches are, you're allowed a tax deduction. So isn't that support of the church as well? So there's a lot there to chew on. I'll just throw it all over to you to handle.
Yeah, thanks for that. That issue comes up a lot, tax exemption. And I'm not a tax attorney, but I have looked at this history a little bit. And I can tell you that the idea of tax exemption for houses of worship, it's really old in Western culture. Pagan temples in Rome, ancient Rome, were not taxed. And when the empire Christianized, that was handed down to churches, and it just continued all through European history, being picked up and replicated in this country as well. Now, it was challenged some years back, I think maybe in the 60s. The Supreme Court handed down a ruling in a case called Walls v. Tax Commission of the State of New York, which you can look up. And the court basically held there that while the Constitution did not mandate tax exemption for houses of worship, it was not considered a violation of the First Amendment to offer it because it was also extended to a variety of secular organizations. Think about it for a minute. A lot of the charities you may donate to, environmental groups, civil liberties groups, women's rights groups, social justice groups, what have you, are also tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. So you get that benefit, which is considered an indirect benefit, being spread to different types of entities. If it were limited to religious groups, I think it clearly would be a problem. One more thing about this that we need to consider is that there is a law dating from the 1950s called the Johnson Amendment. It was sponsored by Lyndon Johnson when he was a US Senator, saying basically that if you have tax exemption, you're not supposed to intervene in partisan politics by endorsing or opposing a candidate. Now, you can address issues all you want, but you can't tell people, vote for or against somebody. So houses of worship aren't supposed to do that, and neither are groups like my own or the other 501c3 groups. Now, we know that happens. Some houses of worship violate that law. We actually have asked the IRS to look into that because there are some flagrant violations. The IRS has not really shown much initiative in this area, but it's something that we do think ought to be given a much closer examination than it is right now, because there are violations out there.
Yeah, and also I'll just add, and you said you're not an expert, so maybe this is an area that's going beyond your expertise. But I mean, I was looking into assisted living, Lutheran-sponsored home, I guess, and because someone I knew was in there, and it turned out they were very, very profitable, and they had a tax exempt status because they ran it with Lutheran principles. That's I don't know if they were kind of skating on thin ice or what. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, that's pretty common for institutions like that to be tax exempt if they're run by religious institutions. I mean, think about, a lot of religious hospitals fall into those rules too. I would say one more thing about tax exemption that's very interesting. You sometimes hear folks on the far right say that religion's being persecuted in the United States. They make that argument a lot. But as a matter of fact, the tax laws favor religious organizations. A house of worship is assumed to be tax exempt by mere dint of its existence. So as soon as a house of worship pulls together, it's tax exempt. They don't have to apply for it. By contrast, if you and I wanted to get together and start a group to say, save the environment or fight climate change or whatever that might be, we would have to apply for tax exemption. And if we didn't make the case strongly enough, we could be denied. So religious groups actually get preferential treatment in the law right now when it comes to tax exemption. So I point that out just to sort of debunk the idea that the government in any way is hostile to religion or is persecuting it. That's just one example. There are many, many others where our laws favor religious organizations in ways that they don't secular ones.
Yeah, and I think also a non-religious organization has to submit financial information on a regular basis.
That's right. It's called a Form 990. Every year you have to file this detailed financial form with the IRS that anybody can look at. Houses of worship are totally exempt from that.
Right. Okay, so we'll move on to other topics. So did people who were part of the Christian nation practice Christianity of the love thy neighbor, acceptance of non-Christians? So I don't know whether they're addressing at the time of our nation's founding or now, or maybe both.
Well, let me just say about that, because I think there's an historical thread that's kind of moved through these movements. At different times in our history, as I mentioned in my remarks, these sort of theocratic movements have sprung up, Puritans and being an early manifestation of it. And then this group, the National Reform Association, and today's what we're calling Christian nationalists. These are people who don't believe in the idea of separation of church and state. They are convinced that their particular expression of Christianity is the only true and good one, the only one that's pleasing to God, and they seek to align it with the government. Sometimes would force other people to be a part of it or to acknowledge it, or would oppress anybody who dissented. Does that type of mindset lead to violence? Yes, it has. There have been instances of that in our history. I'm not a theologian, but I would certainly believe that any religion worth its salt would teach you, at the very least, tolerance of those who thought differently. But there have been folks throughout our history who not only have turned their backs on tolerance, they have embraced force or coercion or violence. And unfortunately, we still see expressions of that today under Christian nationalism.
Yeah. Okay. So Anne is interested to find out what impact or influence has your organization had on government policy?
Yes, well, obviously, we've been around for a long time, 1947. So this is our 75th year. And there's information in the chat, but if you want to learn more, where our website is au.org. So it's very simple. We've filed cases in courts. We've been involved lobbying in Washington, D.C. to the extent that that's allowed for a nonprofit. We've been involved in state government. We've rallied people around these things. And, there's some information on our site about some of our prominent battles. But, one of the main things we have just tried to do is help people to understand the importance of separation of church and state, not only protecting your religious freedom, but some of these other issues that I've mentioned during my talk, how it's intimately connected with reproductive freedom, LGBTQ rights, the right to read and the right to learn, the right to question, the right to doubt, the ability to change your mind about religion. I mean, women's rights. I mean, there are so many rights out there that are connected to the separation of church and state. And our goal has been to make that clear, that connection, and to let people know that if they really undermine that wall, it's not just separation that falls, but a lot of the rights that are hinged on that as well.
Okay, and so Mark has a couple comment and a question on the appointment of Supreme Court justices. I mean, he notes that 3 were put on the court by Trump, and it's appointed by the president. Isn't this a violation of separation of the branches of government and or separation of powers? And do you have any insight on this? And I know there's been a lot of talk about reform, so maybe you can talk about what can be done, what requires a constitutional amendment. I mean, that's a broad topic, but
it's an interesting one though, because there has been some attention focused on the Supreme Court lately in ways that hadn't been there in the past, because people are rightly perceiving the court as a partisan institution. The idea of the separation of powers is that these 3 branches are going to operate independently, but there's checks on one another. In theory, the check on the Supreme Court is that the president is naming the appointments, but the Senate has the right to turn them down if it so chooses, and hasn't really been doing that lately. But nevertheless, it's interesting because federal judicial appointments are lifetime appointments. And some people are starting to wonder if maybe that ought to be looked at, if it's a good idea, if there should be maybe staggered terms and so on. Now, at Americans United, we haven't endorsed any of these particular ideas, but I think it's time to seriously examine some of them. It may require constitutional amendments to look at some of these things, and that's always a challenge. But just because we've had something that has been around for a long time and seems to have worked, doesn't mean it can't be fine-tuned in some ways if it doesn't seem to be performing for us in the way that it has in the past.
Okay, thanks for addressing that. So here, Steve asked a question. So for some religions, for example, Reform Judaism and Islam, denying a woman access to abortion if she wishes to have one is considered unethical. So how will the court reconcile its draft abortion ruling with the religious beliefs of some people?
Yeah, you're going to be hearing a lot more about that question, I think, in the months to come. If the Supreme Court follows through with the draft opinion that was leaked and overturns Roe v. Wade, some people are going to be arguing very strenuously that that abortion has a significant religious freedom angle to it. And that in some cases, and my understanding is in Judaism, that if there's a conflict between the rights of the fetus and the rights of the mother, that the right of the mother takes precedent. So the court will be challenged on this. I don't know, maybe there'll be new litigation, but certainly it's going to be a topic of discussion. I mean, there's going to be, fortunately, quite a bit of fallout from that. I don't think the American people were quite ready for that happening. There were polls a few weeks ago before the draft opinion leaked showing that the majority of Americans didn't think the Supreme Court was on the verge of overturning Roe v. Wade, even though the oral argument in the Dobbs case certainly would have led one to think that. So it's coming as a surprise to many Americans. And when that happens, there definitely is going to be a political and cultural fallout.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into a question here to ask you to kind of address societal trends. So what do you think has caused a resurgence in people being more religiously focused and wanting to enact limitations based on their religious beliefs?
Yeah, I think we're in a situation where, because so many people have disengaged or pulled out of the process, we're seeing extreme voices getting more power than they probably ought to have. And that's alarming, that's scary, but we're at that point right now in our history where so many people have just aren't registered, aren't voting, aren't paying attention, that it creates this vacuum. And religious folks who have, really kind of extreme religious views, I'll give them their due in this area. They're very engaged politically. They always have been since the rise of the moral majority under Jerry Falwell in the late 1970s. A lot of what he did, a lot of what he said was offensive, but a lot of what he did was simply good old-fashioned political organizing, in the extent that he made sure people were registered and got them to the polls. There's nothing wrong with that. That's good politics 101. So we're seeing groups now taking that process and focusing it on this sort of narrow segment of the society. And as a result, I sometimes think that in many parts of the country, you really have a minority view of calling the shots instead of what people really want to see. And the only fix to that is to get more people involved in the political system.
Yeah. So Derek wants to know, I think it's more of a comment. What is the difference between religious prosecution of people showing the likeness of Muhammad and banning or burning books in our schools and libraries?
Yeah, I am not in favor of deliberately provoking and doing things that are offensive to folks personally when it comes to religion. I think we should respect one another's beliefs. Having said that, all religions are open to criticism. All religions are open to people mocking them, saying that they're wrong, and attacking them verbally. Obviously, no violence. And that does include the right of people to engage in activities that offend Muslims, that offend Christians, that offend Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, whatever. People are going to do those things. The best answer for that is for religious leaders to simply accept that in a free and open society, there is going to be that type of mocking and satire and very strong pointed criticism of their faith, and to accept the fact that the government does not provide a remedy for that. That if your feelings are hurt because somebody made fun of your religion, well, that's a shame. You can maybe enter into a dialogue with that person and explain why your feelings were hurt, try to encourage them not to engage in those behaviors, but the government doesn't have the power to come in this country anyway, and punish somebody because they mocked your religion. Now, there are societies and countries where that does happen. I was just reading a story recently about some individuals in Pakistan who are in prison because they committed blasphemy. And we know that happens in Saudi Arabia, and we know that happens in some other countries. Blasphemy is a concept that is foreign to American law and ought to be. So the short answer there is for religious groups to simply accept the fact that they will sometimes be subject to mocking and ridicule, as all institutions are, and also to understand that there's a difference between government action and what happens to you in non-government settings if you engage in those behaviors. You can be sanctioned by your employer for saying things that are insensitive. You can be criticized on social media for doing that. People might try to so-called cancel you, but those are private initiatives. The government shouldn't be allowed to do those things, but private entities can and will.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. So Anne comments, excellent talk, and any way to get a copy. So just to let the audience know, we are recording this and we'll more than likely put up on our website. Actually, it'll go on our YouTube channel. There'll be a link there on our website. So you can go to encorelearning.net and just navigate through and find the link. Well, it'll be a few days before we get it up there. So anyone that wants to watch this or send a copy to other people, yeah, fantastic idea. Now, Marge is asking, please clarify how opposition to abortion rights involves the constitutional principle of separation of religion and state. And I, may not want to get too deep into that. We've got a lot of other questions, but feel free to.
Yeah, I would just say this about reproductive freedom generally. If you go back in our history and look, you'll see that there were times when birth control was banned in this country because of opposition to it by religious groups. That was very common in the 19th century into the 20th century. The Supreme Court nullified those laws in a 1965 case called Griswold v. Connecticut. So the idea that your reproductive freedom, whether it's access to birth control or ability to get an abortion, would be subject to someone else's religion is offensive and does raise serious issues of separation of church and state. So we're basically arguing here that all of our laws, whether they deal with reproductive freedom or other aspects, need to have a secular rationale, not religious ones.
Okay, so we've got quite a few questions. I mean, can you stay on like 5 minutes longer? I'm just trying to.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we can work through more of these. So did the passage of RIFRA, RIFRA, cause an acceleration in erosion of the wall of separation?
Well, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 was born of good intentions, and that was designed to protect minority religious expression, which had been curbed by some Supreme Court rulings. And I was around back then working on that issue, and I remember when that law was passed. Unfortunately, what happened is that it's been misinterpreted by the U.S. Supreme Court and some lower federal courts that have turned it into a weapon. RIFRA was intended to be a shield for people's religious freedom, not a weapon to lash out at others. So I think the problem is not so much with the law, it's how it's been interpreted. If we could get it back to its original interpretation, we'd be a lot better off.
Yeah, okay, yeah, on the area of interpretation. So Zachary is asking, is there a fear that SCOTUS will adopt an unprecedented accommodationist interpretation of the Establishment Clause? And I think you touched on that, but if you want to elaborate, go ahead.
Yes, actually, I think that's a good summation of what's already happening. Just for folks who may not know some of these terms, accommodationism is kind of a euphemism that opponents of separation of church and state have used. They've said, oh, we just want religion to be accommodated, but that's not really what they're after. They're after methods of control and giving religious groups more power to determine how society is ordered. That's not accommodation. So, but the Supreme Court is moving toward that. And Establishment Clause is that part of the First Amendment that says that there will be no law respecting an establishment of religion. As that clause shrinks, we see fewer and fewer things being considered a violation of it, and that opens us up to basically various types of religious control of our society, and that's definitely a concern.
Yeah, and here's one kind of, I guess, a finer point. What cases involve religious expression versus conduct? How might the court approach them in terms of free speech or free religious exercise? Right,
exactly. For a long time, there was a sort of an understanding that religious freedom obviously included your right to believe anything you want, and with a few controls to say what you want, but that your behavior that flows from that might be curtailed if it infringed on the rights of others. So I think, religious expression is pretty widely protected in the United States right now. Where I live, there are often people out in public areas preaching and passing out religious literature and this sort of thing, which is completely fine. Everybody can be in those public spaces. As I mentioned earlier, the right to kind of criticize other religions, to write articles and to express your point of view, that's widely protected. It isn't so much expression and even the right to protest. This is Pride Month, and there are a lot of Pride events going on around the country, and sometimes conservative religious people will be at those events to protest. As long as they're not engaging in violent activity or disrupting them or trying to stop those events, they have the right to be there, even though I may disagree with their message. So I think religious expression is pretty well protected. What concerns me right now is that some of the behaviors that flow from those beliefs do infringe on the rights of others, And I think that's where we need to put the brakes on a little bit.
Okay, thanks for that perspective. So Zachary has another question. In religious cases, has SCOTUS historically treated Christianity differently from other faiths?
Well, it's not supposed to. When the idea of separation of church and state is neutrality, that all religions will be treated on an equal level. Now, let's be real here, though. This is a country that, as I said earlier in my remarks, 96% of folks identified with Christianity in the 1950s, and only now we're seeing those numbers start to drop. So certainly there have been instances and cases where we have strayed from separation of church and state, and Christianity has probably been favored in ways that we would recognize are not appropriate today. Yeah, I'm sure that's happened. And what we need to do about that history, again, as I said during my remarks, is face up to it and try to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Okay. Now, Laura asks, what about the argument that some people disagree over what is a belief and what is fact, and say that things like gender being fluid is a religious belief, not a fact? And I think that also gets to the point of when there's some discrimination, religious discrimination over that belief.
But I think there's an unfortunate tendency sometimes for folks to label things that are not religious beliefs as religious beliefs. And I don't think that has served us very well. I mean, we can have these robust debates without trying to label things that are not religion, under that terminology. And I think for some of these discussions, whether it's gender issues or climate change or evolution, we really need to understand that there also needs to be a separation of science and religion, and look to the science and say, what is the science teaching us? There was a long period continuing into the modern era where some folks simply will not accept the theory of evolution, and they try to keep that out of public schools. And we saw people arguing that climate change can't be real. God wouldn't do that to us. That's fake. We don't want that in schools either. And now they're attacking a variety of gender issues, arguing that that's not, God doesn't want that type of expression, so that's not valid. Rather than look at these as religious controversies, I would instead say, let's look at what the scientific consensus is and go from there. Understand that some folks may have religious objections. To the extent that they can be accommodated, okay, but if their view is that their accommodation is that they're going to control what's taught in a public institution, that's not an accommodation, that's religious control.
Okay. Now, we have a number of people interested in getting additional information on different parts of the topics that you've covered. So one is, what other secular organizations that we as AU members can reach out to, plus collectively planned lobbying efforts?
Right. Well, I would say that we're already doing that. We reach out to a large number of religious and secular organizations to work on the issues of separation of church and state. Now, I mentioned that we were founded in 1947 by religious leaders, but we're much broader today. We have religious and non-religious people involved. So, but we're still working with Baptist groups. There are still a lot of Baptists out there who are strongly in favor of separation of church and state. We're working with mainline Protestants, Unitarians, progressive Catholics. At the same time, we're working with groups like the Secular Coalition and American Atheists and Freedom from Religion Foundation. We really do want a broad effort here, because what we want is an effort that shows the true diversity of America, from the most committed believer to the most devout atheist and everybody in between, standing up for separation of church and state, as opposed to what the other side is offering, which is a very narrow, tiny segment, usually of the American Christian community, that doesn't represent our diversity. So yeah, we're making those connections, and those folks have been helping us out with lobbying efforts and court cases and holding events together and all sorts of wonderful things.
Yeah, Louise is wondering, given the what she characterizes as a radical right-wing shift in recent years, is your membership increasing? Are you finding that there is a growing alarm, or are you seeing a continued apathy to combat this shift?
I actually think there is a growing alarm and an understanding that many of these rights are in jeopardy, especially this Supreme Court draft opinion overturning Roe was a real punch to the gut for a lot of people, and making realize, yeah, this is serious. January 6, 2021, the assault on the Capitol. I mentioned again the Christian nationalist presence there. That couldn't have been any more obvious. The interesting thing about doing activism in the modern era is how much of it is virtual or online. And that was happening even before COVID. So people are interacting with organizations like ours in non-traditional ways. Let me just show you something here. We publish this magazine, a Church and State magazine, every month, and I edit this magazine. And some people really like to still get a physical print magazine in their hands that they can read. But a lot of other people would rather be involved in social media and see tweets and Instagram and Facebook. What we're trying to do as an organization, and we're certainly not the only ones doing this in the nonprofit world and advocacy, is meet everybody where they would like to be met. So if you really want to sit down and read a print magazine, which I still love to do and many other folks like to do, we got that for you. If you want to see tweets and follow on social media or get emails, we've got that for you too. So we have to look at this way of communicating in light of current realities and just bring the message forth however we can. And I think if we're successful in that, working through the media, working through the court of public opinion, we can energize folks to the crisis that is the current moment. It's challenging, but I think it is happening.
Great. Now, just a couple more things. We're almost at the end here. What materials can you recommend on the founding of the U.S. in regards to separation of church and state?
Yes, I would recommend, there are many excellent books, but one I think is the best is by a gentleman named Frank Lambert. And it's just titled with something very simple like Separation of Church and State. There's a subtitle, but it escapes me at the moment, but it's Lambert. Frank Lambert is a professor at Purdue. It's an excellent primer on the history of separation of church and state, why that was what the founders intended, debunks the Christian nation myth. That's something you definitely want to check out. There's a fellow on our staff named Andrew Seidel. He's written 2 books. The one is coming out this fall. It's called The Crusaders. It's about people trying to kind of erode the separation of church and state. His works are excellent. I mentioned some of the writers earlier who have written about Christian nationalism, Catherine Stewart's The Power Worshippers, The Flag and the Cross, which is a new book by Philip Gorski, and a co-author whose name escapes me at the moment, but that's an excellent book. So, just sort of, there are a lot of resources out there that are debunking the idea of the Christian nation myth. And, there's no shortage of material. And well, the good news is a lot of it is really user-friendly. It's not like overly academic or written in a way that is legalistic.
Yeah, actually, Bill mentions The Flag and the Cross in a question of his by Samuel Perry and Philip
Gorski. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and because he's wondering, asking about any other books that detail the Christian nationalism, the history of the Christian nationalism movement. But that's a good one, I guess. So
that's an excellent one. And also Catherine Stewart's The Power Worshippers, very good. There are others. Andrew Whitehead has written in this subject. Athena Butler. If you put Christian nationalism into just Googling or even checking some of the book sites, you're going to pull up a lot of material. Just make sure you're not getting something that's from the conservative perspective, because there's some of that out there too. There is a because the religious right, or whatever you want to call them, they've got a cottage industry of promoting this myth of the Christian nation. So there's just a lot of, just as there's bad science material out there, there's bad history material out there as well. I will say this, my email is Boston, that's BOSTON, Boston@au.org. If anybody would like to email me, I can provide a reading list that I've put together over the years, and I'm happy to get that to folks.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to kind of close this out, but kind of throw it back to you and just say, mention Derek has this interesting thing. He says, freedom is the distance between church and state. If that's not your motto, maybe you ought to think about adopting it. That's an interesting way to phrase it. And also, so what I'm going to just throw it back to you with a couple of questions from people. One is, what success stories do you have regarding secularism today? And also an interesting question, how might I approach a conversation about secularism with an ardent conservative. I worry many might confuse secularism with state atheism. So
Yeah, a couple things about that. One is folks talked about some of our achievements. I can name a couple. Some of you may remember a case from a few years ago, 2005, in Dover, Pennsylvania, where the school board was trying to teach intelligent design, which is a form of creationism. We were in court with the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Center for Science Education, and we won that case. So that was a big victory. A few years before that, we sued Judge Roy Moore, the infamous 10 Commandments judge from Alabama, who tried to put the 10 Commandments in the courthouse. And in Montgomery, Alabama, we sued him. We won, along with the ACLU again. That was an important victory. In 1998, we blocked an effort in Congress to add an amendment, a school prayer, kind of a school prayer amendment on steroids to the Constitution. It would have allowed school prayer and undermined separation of church and state in many other ways. We blocked that in the House of Representatives. There have been a lot of other victories, but those are some that come to mind. Right now, we're fighting in the courts to make sure that people have the right to engage in adoptions and foster care without being the victims of religious discrimination, which is shockingly common in this country. People want to adopt a child or provide foster care, and since many of those agencies are religiously affiliated, they're told that we don't work with non-Christians, and it's even though they're publicly funded, so it's a real problem. We're working on that. Now, the second question about secularism is a very important one, because many people on the more conservative side of things do tend to equate secularism with hostility toward religion or atheism. That's not what secularism is. Secularism is where the government says we have no opinion on religious matters. We leave that up to our citizens. We don't have a view. We're not hostile. We're not in favor. We're not pro-Christian. We're not pro-atheist. We're not pro-Buddhist. We're not pro-Muslim. We're not pro-Jew. We're just basically neutral. Secularism is the platform upon which our religious freedom rests. And if we erode secularism, what happens is that it just becomes a situation where, depending on where you live, whatever the dominant religious expression happens to be, may be the one that your children are exposed to in a public school, or that your local government decides it's going to support. Conservatives ought to be concerned about that, because they could be in the minority in some parts of the country, but more importantly, because it puts the government into an area where it doesn't belong. You know, conservatives are supposed to be about small government and not a lot of control, and not the state telling you what to do. Why on earth would they favor the idea of the government getting involved in religion, which is one of our most intimate and personal decisions? Secularism prevents that from happening.
Okay, I think we're going to have to do a wrap on that, but this has been absolutely fantastic, Rob. And I want to thank the audience for some fantastic questions. And I get a feeling that we still have a lot of the audience still with us. We could probably just keep going. There may still be interest, but we do need to close this out. And I just want to thank you, Rob, for coming on.
Yeah, I did give the email. And like I said, if anyone has questions after the fact, feel free. Boston@au.org. I'm happy to answer those for you.
There you go. For anyone with the more questions that we didn't get to. And when we close this out, please stay on to complete the survey. And you can certainly give your thanks to Rob as a part of completing that survey. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Okay, take care.